In 2009, a fossil unearthed in a Colombian coal mine set off one of paleontology's strangest controversies. What began as a 42-foot prehistoric snake, published in a top journal, was soon reborn as a 50-foot media monster. Beneath the headlines, rushed calculations, institutional pressures, and wild climate claims transformed fragmentary bones into spectacle, and no one questioned how the measurements kept growing. The truth behind those numbers changes what we think we know about the prehistoric world, and what science is quietly willing to exaggerate. So, how did the world's biggest snake get even bigger without anyone noticing? The Cerrejón coal mine in northern Colombia runs deep into the earth, its black walls soaked with the memory of vanished forests. In the sticky heat of the Paleocene layer, miners and paleontologists worked side by side, sifting through slabs of ancient mudstone and coal. It was here, among tangled roots and the remains of giant turtles, that a fossil first caught the attention of the field crew. The specimen was heavy, coated in the dark residue of a swamp that had not seen daylight for nearly 60 million years. At first glance, it looked like a section of petrified branch, or perhaps a chunk of some prehistoric crocodile armor. Measuring nearly 4 inches across, the vertebra was far larger than anything expected from the usual finds. Initial notes logged it as a possible Dioirosaur, an extinct crocodile known from these same beds. The shape fit the expectation, robust and slightly flattened, with a central canal that seemed right for a croc. But the fossil resisted easy classification. As the team cleaned away the last traces of coal dust, subtle clues began to surface. The vertebra curvature was all wrong for a crocodile. The neural arch swept upward in a gentle arc, and the centrum bore a T-shaped cross-section almost never seen in crocs, but common among the world's largest snakes. The fossil surface, still pitted and slick from its long burial, held the story of a creature that moved not with the rigid gait of a reptile on land, but with the muscular undulation of a serpent. The field crew, anonymous in their hard hats and dust masks, worked methodically, bagging and tagging each new fragment. Over the next several weeks, more vertebrae emerged from the same layer, some smaller, some even larger, all scattered and disarticulated. The bones were stained deep brown by tannic acids from ancient palms, their surfaces etched by the slow chemistry of coal formation. Every piece was cataloged, wrapped, and shipped to the lab, the original field log noting only a possible crocodilian origin. No one could have guessed what these fragments would become. Above ground, the mine's machinery rumbled on, chewing through the Paleocene swamp. Underground, the clues began to point in a new direction. The vertebrae proportions, the spacing of the articulating surfaces, the gentle arc of the neural spine, each detail whispered of a snake, not a crocodile. The setting itself, a stagnant oxygen-poor rainforest thick with palms and standing water, hinted at the kind of world where such a creature could thrive. The fossil's true identity waited for a second look, a careful reanalysis that would upend every assumption made in the field that day. Jason Head, the lead paleontologist, approached the task of measuring the unknown snake with the caution of a forensic scientist. Each vertebra was removed from its plaster jacket, cleaned, and measured with calipers down to the millimeter. The most reliable dimension, the width of the vertebral centrum, became the foundation for every calculation. Head assembled a dataset of the largest, best-preserved mid-body vertebrae, bones that in living snakes anchor the thickest part of the body and provide the most stable scaling point. But a number alone meant little without context. To turn fossil into animal, Head needed a living standard. He gathered measurements from 8 species of modern boid snakes, including green anacondas and boa constrictors, and assembled a regression model that linked vertebral width to total body length. The relationship was logarithmic, not linear. For Titanoboa, the largest vertebra measured around 12.5 centimeters across. Plugged into the regression, it produced a total length of 12.8 meters, about 42.7 feet. This estimate was not a wild guess or a leap of faith. It was anchored in the mathematics of comparative anatomy, checked against a century's worth of museum specimens. Head's team applied the same method to calculate mass, using the cylindrical volume of a living anaconda as a model. The result was a projected weight of 1,135 kilograms, or about 2,500 pounds. These numbers, published in the February 2009 issue of Nature, became the scientific benchmark for Titanoboa's size. Yet every calculation carried a shadow of uncertainty. The method assumed that Titanoboa's vertebrae were spaced like those of a modern anaconda, a detail impossible to verify without a complete skeleton. Modern snakes of the same species can vary up to 15% in length for a given vertebra size. Using the largest single bone rather than an average risked inflating the final figure. Even so, Head's published estimate remained conservative by design. Colleague Jonathan Block argued that if Titanoboa's proportions differed even slightly, the true length could reach 47 feet or more. But Head's team drew a clear line: 42.7 feet and 2,500 pounds, grounded in what the bones could prove, not what the imagination might allow. This number, precise, peer-reviewed, and publicly recorded, set the official record, even as the seeds of controversy waited in the margins. Doubts began to surface before the plaster jackets were even cracked open in the lab. The numbers, 42 feet and 2,500 pounds, looked impressive on paper, but behind the scenes, not everyone was convinced that such a snake could function as a living animal. Biomechanists, accustomed to weighing the limits of flesh and bone, started asking uncomfortable questions. A snake of that size, living in a world already pushing the upper limits of tropical heat, would have faced a unique challenge: its own body heat. Like all reptiles, Titanoboa relied on the environment to regulate its temperature. But with a mass that large metabolic heat from digestion and movement would not dissipate easily. In a climate hovering near 90 degrees Fahrenheit, even a few extra degrees could spell disaster. The risk was not just discomfort, overheating, could shut down muscles, scramble nerves, and kill an animal before it finished digesting its last meal. Then came the question of muscle power. Modern green anacondas, the heaviest snakes alive, generate about 150 pounds per square inch when they constrict prey. The scaling equations suggested that Titanoboa could have reached more than double that force, close to 400 pounds per square inch. But muscle strength does not scale perfectly with size. At some point, mass outpaces the ability to generate force. Would a snake this massive be able to tighten its coils with enough pressure to subdue prey, or would its own bulk become a liability? On land, the problem grew more complicated. 2,500 pounds pressing down on a belly barely 1 foot off the ground would put enormous stress on internal organs. Without the support of water, even the most robust snake might struggle to move, let alone hunt. Vertebral studies hinted at adaptations for an aquatic life: broad flattened bones and articulation points that suggested powerful side-to-side swimming, not the sinuous crawling of a land dweller. The swampy Cerrejón rainforest, with its standing water and soft mud, may have been more than just a backdrop. It might have been a necessity for an animal this size to survive at all. Each of these questions chipped away at the certainty of the original measurements. The fossil record could show the bones, but not the living reality. The numbers in the Nature paper were precise, but the animal they described seemed to exist at the very edge of what biology could allow. As the debate simmered, it became clear that the story of Titanoboa was no longer just about what the bones could prove. It was about what kind of world could have produced such a creature, and whether the science behind its size could withstand the weight of its own claims. The numbers on Titanoboa's vertebrae were not just about making headlines. They became a thermometer for an ancient world. The logic behind that leap came from a simple rule in biology. Cold-blooded animals, known as ectotherms, tend to grow larger when the environment is warmer. That principle, seen in modern snakes and lizards, formed the backbone of a new line of reasoning. If a snake could reach 42 feet in length and weigh as much as a small car, the Paleocene must have been far hotter than today's tropics. Paleontologists and climate scientists began to treat Titanoboa's size as a proxy for temperature. They worked backward, using the snake's dimensions to estimate the climate it would have needed to survive. The calculations were bold. For an animal of this scale to function, models suggested a mean annual temperature between 86 and 93 degrees Fahrenheit, far above the current Amazon, which averages closer to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. The argument followed a chain. Bigger snakes need more heat to digest food and move their massive bodies, so the Cerrejón rainforest must have been a hothouse where warmth was constant and unrelenting. This approach, elegant on paper, carried its own risks. It asked the fossil record to do double duty, turning a few scattered bones into a global climate gauge. Paleoclimatologists like Cale Snyderman raised a cautionary flag. They pointed to ancient Australia, where lizards grew over 16 feet long in climates that were only mildly warm by today's standards. If giant reptiles could evolve in cooler epochs, maybe temperature alone was not the whole story. Still, the Titanoboa measurements swept into climate debates. The numbers appeared in scientific journals, conference slides, and reports used by environmental policymakers. The logic was stark. If the Paleocene could produce a snake this size, then Earth's ancient atmosphere must have been thick with heat-trapping carbon dioxide, a warning for our own future. Yet the data did not always line up. Marine sediment cores pulled from ancient seabeds told a different story, hinting at average temperatures closer to 82 or 88 degrees Fahrenheit. Warmer than today, yes, but not the inferno required by the size-based models. That discrepancy left a gap that could not be bridged by vertebrae alone. For every vertebra measured and every climate curve drawn, the vulnerability of the method became harder to ignore. The bones of Titanoboa offered a tantalizing clue, but not a certainty. In the end, the fossil became both a symbol of prehistoric gigantism and a cautionary tale about reading too much from too little. The climate thermometer logic, once so persuasive, now stood on unsteady ground, its numbers debated in labs and policy rooms alike. December 22, 2008, the Titanoboa manuscript landed on the desk of Nature's editorial office. The field season had barely ended. Fossils from Cerrejón were still being cataloged, some vertebrae unprepared, yet the pressure to publish was mounting. In the world of high-profile paleontology, speed can mean the difference between a scientific milestone and a missed opportunity. The peer review window for Titanoboa was unusually tight, just 6 weeks from submission to acceptance. For a discovery of this scale, such a compressed timeline left little room for second thoughts or extended debate. Editors, aware of the competition from rival teams and the promise of headlines, pushed the process forward. Public relations staff at the Smithsonian and the University of Florida prepared press releases and exhibit announcements before the ink was dry on the reviewer reports. The embargo meant to keep results confidential until official publication started to fray. Smithsonian Magazine ran a feature on Titanoboa before the Nature paper was released, breaking protocol and sparking quiet frustration among the authors. The story was out. The numbers, 42 feet and 2,500 pounds, were already making waves, but the narrative was no longer in the hands of the scientists who had measured the bones. Behind closed doors, museum exhibit planners worked off drafts and preliminary data. The Grand Hall display was green-lit, its dimensions extrapolated from the largest vertebrae, not from a complete skeleton. The model would stretch 48 feet, its girth a full 3 feet across. There was no published evidence for this size, but the drive for spectacle was real. Attendance projections and donor pitches depended on a snake that could outdo any living anaconda. The rush to publication brought its own hazards. Peer reviewers had just weeks to scrutinize scaling equations, check regression models, and weigh the assumptions that turned fossil fragments into a living giant. With the exhibit launch tied to the paper's release, there was little appetite for delay. Any uncertainty about vertebra spacing, or about the impact of fossil preparation on measurements was set aside in favor of a clean, headline-ready number. The rush undermined careful scientific verification. In the background, grant officers took note. The promise of a world record snake drew new funding for Cerrejón expeditions, fueling a feedback loop. The bigger the claim, the greater the support. Yet the chain of custody for the fossils, from mine to lab to museum, remained opaque. Documentation on specimen selection and preparation was limited, with only the best preserved vertebrae included in the final analysis. The story of Titanoboa's size, once a cautious calculation, was now shaped as much by institutional timelines and publicity demands as by the bones themselves. When the Nature paper finally appeared in February 2009, the official estimate, 42.7 feet, was already overshadowed by the spectacle of the exhibit and the headlines it inspired. The vulnerability of fast-tracked science was clear. Unchecked assumptions could slip through the cracks when the clock was ticking and the world was watching. Oceanographers working in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea began drilling deep into ancient seabeds, extracting cores that preserved a chemical record of Earth's climate. Each layer of mud and microfossil shell acted as a time capsule, locking in the ratio of oxygen isotopes, oxygen-16 and oxygen-18, at the moment it was formed. These ratios, when measured with mass spectrometers, offered a thermometer for ancient ocean temperatures, independent of anything found on land. By 2012, teams analyzing these cores published a series of results that challenged the prevailing narrative. The numbers told a different story. Average sea surface temperatures during the Paleocene hovered between 82 and 88 degrees Fahrenheit. This was undeniably warm, but fell short of the 86 to 93 degrees Fahrenheit required by the climate models built on Titanoboa's size. The oceanic data suggested a world closer to the modern Amazon than to a prehistoric hothouse. The implications rippled through the paleoclimate community. Marine proxies, considered among the most reliable for reconstructing past temperatures, now stood in direct conflict with the land-based logic that had turned Titanoboa into a climate thermometer. If the seas were cooler than the models predicted, could a giant snake really serve as a proxy for global warmth? Or did the relationship between body size and temperature break down when tested against the chemical record? Researchers debated the calibration of their isotope curves. Some argued that local conditions, freshwater influx, salinity shifts, or ancient ocean currents could skew the readings. Others pointed out that marine organisms like foraminifera, whose shells provided the raw data, might have lived at different depths or migrated seasonally, introducing further uncertainty. Still, the broad pattern remained. The ocean cores consistently failed to match the extreme temperatures inferred from Titanoboa's measurements. This contradiction forced a new set of questions. If giant snakes could thrive in a world that was merely warm, not sweltering, then the logic underpinning the size as thermometer model began to unravel. The fossil record, once thought to offer a simple answer, now raised a paradox. The bones from Cerrejón demanded a world hotter than the seas seemed to allow. The ocean cores, in turn, insisted that the Paleocene was only moderately warmer than today. As marine scientists published their findings, the debate over Titanoboa's true place in the ancient ecosystem intensified. The evidence from the ocean floor cast doubt on the idea that climate alone dictated the upper limits of reptile size. In the background, the question lingered. What other forces, habitat, prey availability, evolutionary quirks, might have shaped the rise of giants in the Paleocene rainforest? The climate thermometer, once a neat solution, now stood as a puzzle with missing pieces. June 2024, Western India. In the lignite beds of Gujarat, a team of paleontologists from IIT Roorkee and the Geological Survey of India worked under the glare of floodlights, pulling vertebrae from a seam of Eocene-age rock. The bones, heavy with ancient minerals, measured up to 127 millimeters across, just over 5 inches, matching and in some cases exceeding the largest vertebrae ever found for a snake. Over the course of several weeks, the team recovered 27 vertebrae from a single individual, each one cataloged and measured with the kind of rigor that comes from knowing every millimeter could rewrite the record books. The initial calculations were cautious, using scaling equations tailored to Madsuid snakes, not modern anacondas. The team projected a total length near 15 meters, 49 feet. The numbers, checked and rechecked, placed the snake, named Vasuki indicus, squarely in the league of Titanoboa. But the context was different. The Gujarat fossils came from rocks dated to 47 million years ago, a time when global temperatures were already cooling from their Paleocene peak. This was not the hothouse world of Cerrejón, but a swampy, subtropical landscape on the drifting Indian plate, still hundreds of miles from its collision with Asia. Unlike the media frenzy that followed Titanoboa, the Gujarat team moved with restraint. Their findings appeared first in a peer-reviewed journal, with no oversized models and no press releases promising a 55-foot monster. Lead author Sunil Bajpai emphasized the uncertainties. Vertebrae alone could not reveal soft tissue, and scaling equations carried a margin of error. Yet the implications were clear. Gigantism in snakes had not vanished with the Paleocene heat. It had reappeared in a cooler epoch, in a different corner of the world, challenging the idea that temperature alone set the upper limits of reptile size. The numbers from Gujarat forced a new question. If a snake rivaling Titanoboa could thrive in the Eocene, what really drives reptilian giants? The answer, it seemed, would not come from climate charts alone. In the heart of Miocene South America, long after the last Titanoboa vanished, another giant snake left its mark in the fossil record. Paleontologists working in the wetlands of what is now Venezuela recovered vertebrae from a colossal anaconda, measuring over 17 feet. These bones date to roughly 12 million years ago, a time when the global climate was cooler than the Paleocene. Yet the swamps of the Pebas system stretched for hundreds of miles across the Amazon basin. The Pebas wetlands were not just vast, they were teeming with life. Fossil beds show a mosaic of slow-moving rivers, oxbow lakes, and marshes thick with aquatic plants. Here, prey was abundant. Turtles, fish, crocodiles, and mammals crowded the waterways, offering a buffet for any predator large enough to take advantage. The anaconda's size, while impressive by modern standards, was no outlier in this ecosystem. The fossil record shows that the wetlands supported a cast of oversized reptiles and amphibians, each adapted to a world where water, not temperature, set the rules. South American paleontologists studying these fossils have noticed a pattern. The largest snakes, whether in the Paleocene or the Miocene, are always found in the remains of ancient wetlands. The evidence points away from global temperature as the sole explanation for gigantism. Instead, it is the environment itself, the endless supply of prey, the buoyancy of deep water, and the shelter of tangled vegetation that allows these animals to reach extraordinary size. By examining the Miocene anaconda, researchers have begun to reframe the story of reptile giants. The key is not just heat, but habitat. Wetland ecosystems, with their stability and resources, create the conditions for evolutionary experiments and scale. The rise of these giants is written not just in the climate, but in the mud and water that shaped their world. In the years after Titanoboa's discovery, the headlines focused on climate and size, but a quieter story was written in the bones themselves. Developmental biologists asked how a snake could reach such lengths. Modern giants like the green anaconda achieve bulk by adding more vertebrae as they grow, or by stretching each vertebra longer through processes set in the embryo. Titanoboa's bones told a different story. The vertebrae from Cerrejón showed no evidence of a massive increase in number. Instead, the existing bones grew longer and thicker, a pattern of elongation that does not follow the rules seen in living snakes. This suggests a developmental pathway where the timing of bone growth, how long the embryo keeps adding cells to each vertebra, became uncoupled from the usual genetic signals. The result was a snake that became longer and heavier without a denser backbone. But the fossil record is never neutral. Preservation bias shapes what survives and what is lost. The Cerrejón mine, once a stagnant rainforest swamp, favored burial of large, robust bones in thick mats of coal and mud. Smaller, more delicate skeletons, juveniles, or perhaps moderate-sized adults, were less likely to endure the chemical gauntlet of 60 million years underground. What emerges from the mine is a sample skewed toward the giants, amplifying the impression of a world ruled by a single monstrous species. Yet the size range among the vertebrae is striking. The smallest are just 60% the size of the largest, suggesting either a population with extraordinary growth variation or the quiet presence of multiple species, each adapted to a slightly different ecological niche. The environment played a decisive role. Swampy, oxygen-poor wetlands offered buoyancy and a steady supply of prey, allowing snakes to grow larger than their landlocked relatives. In this view, gigantism was less a product of global temperature than of local conditions, a developmental response to a habitat that rewarded size. The story of Titanoboa's growth is as much about biology and preservation as it is about climate, revealing how the quirks of evolution and the accidents of fossilization can shape our understanding of the past. Statistical scrutiny began in the lab, far from the spectacle of museum halls. A statistician called in to review the original regression models found a subtle but significant pattern. The numbers leaned heavily on the largest, best-preserved vertebrae, not on the average across all specimens. In modern snakes, measurements taken from the largest individual can exaggerate true species size by up to 15%. When this approach is applied to a fossil sample, especially one as incomplete as Titanoboa's, the arithmetic quietly inflates the final estimate. The regression itself depended on the assumption that Titanoboa's proportions matched those of a modern green anaconda, a leap that cannot be confirmed without a full skeleton. The mass calculation followed the same logic, scaling up from living snakes without accounting for possible differences in body shape or density. Each step, from vertebra to headline, introduced a small upward bias. What began as a cautious estimate in a scientific paper grew larger in each retelling, the margin of error quietly absorbed into the myth of a 50-foot serpent. In the fossil lab, the task of freeing Titanoboa's vertebrae from their coal matrix fell to a handful of preparators armed with scalpels, air scribes, and acid baths. Coal-bound fossils demand aggressive methods. Hydrofluoric acid, a standard for dissolving silicate-rich rock, was used to strip away the matrix, but this chemical, while effective, is notorious for its side effects. Even a brief exposure can etch the surface of bone, subtly altering dimensions that later become the basis for headline-grabbing estimates. Preparators selected the largest and least damaged vertebrae for measurement, but the process left behind a chemical footprint, minute pitting, smoothed edges, and sometimes a loss of fine anatomical detail. Documentation from this stage is spotty at best. Field logs track the journey from mine to lab, but records of which specimens underwent which treatments and for how long are incomplete or missing. No chain of custody links a specific vertebrae's acid exposure to the final measurements published in Nature. The absence of detailed preparation logs leaves a gap in the forensic record, making it difficult to reconstruct exactly how much lab work may have nudged the numbers upward. In a field where a few millimeters mean the difference between a 42-foot snake and a 50-foot legend, these gaps matter. Physical alteration, whether accidental or overlooked, becomes part of the story, a hidden variable in the equation that turned ancient bones into a modern spectacle. The Smithsonian's 48-foot Titanoboa replica became more than just a museum display. It was a magnet for crowds and a powerful image for advocacy. Attendance at the Grand Hall surged, with some reports crediting the giant snake for an 18% boost in visitors. The spectacle delivered on its promise. A prehistoric monster, bigger than any living anaconda, stretched across the floor, 3 feet thick at the midsection. For museum marketers, the draw was undeniable. Bigger bones meant bigger headlines, and bigger headlines meant more funding and public attention. But the impact did not stop at the museum doors. Advocacy groups seized the image of Titanoboa to warn about the dangers of unchecked climate change, using the snake's supposed hothouse origins as a symbol of a world made dangerous by rising temperatures. Policy communicators wove Titanoboa into climate campaigns, while skeptics pointed to the same fossil and argued that life flourished in a warmer world. In the process, the line between scientific caution and public message blurred. The uncertainty in the data faded behind the power of spectacle, leaving the stakes of exaggeration to echo through debates far beyond the original fossil bed. In science, spectacle can overshadow substance. Today, museums still display oversized replicas, and headlines outpace peer review, reminding us that public fascination often rewards exaggeration over accuracy. As new fossils rewrite the record, the true size of Titanoboa remains an open question. The lesson is clear. When evidence bends to narrative, even the largest discoveries shrink beneath the weight of myth. What do you think? Fact, fiction, or something in between? Share your thoughts below.